When the priest asked if anyone objected to this marriage, the groom glanced down at his phone, his face draining to a dead, ashen gray, and he didn't say a single word. He bolted straight out of the small church on the outskirts of Chicago, leaving Rosalie Bennett standing alone at the altar, the cheap veil covering a face that was about to completely fall apart. 150 guests held their breath. Aunt Margaret, the woman who had once thrown Rose out of the house when she was 18, screamed about getting back the money she had invested in the wedding. Old Pete, the 68-year-old diner owner who had walked her down the aisle in place of a father, trembled as he struggled to stand, ready to chase after the traitor, but his aging legs refused to cooperate. A few people lifted their phones to record, as if her pain were free entertainment. Rose was 27, wearing a wedding dress she'd bought from a second-hand shop and then mended herself, stitch by stitch, and around her neck hung a tarnished silver heart necklace, the only keepsake she had left from the mother she'd lost when she was 8. In the front row, the framed photographs of her parents sat neatly in place, as though they were witnessing their daughter being betrayed in front of everyone she had ever known. And her heart, a heart that had endured far too much, trusted far too much, hoped far too much, was shattering into 1,000 pieces in the very place that was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. In that exact moment, a man rose from the very last pew, the darkest corner of the church where the colored light from the stained glass never reached. Rose had never seen him before. He was tall, with black hair, storm-gray eyes cold as winter, and a faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow. The 3-piece black suit he wore probably cost more than this entire wedding put together. He walked toward the altar with the calm certainty of a man who owned the world, each measured step echoing through the silent church, until one by one, people stopped breathing and turned to look. He came to a stop in front of Rose. He looked into her eyes as if it wasn't the first time he'd ever seen her, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Then he leaned down, his mouth close to her ear, and whispered something no one else could hear. What he said changed both of their lives forever. And when Rose discovered who that man truly was, the kingpin of Chicago's underground empire, the one who had been quietly watching her for 5 years, who had killed the people who had made her cry, who had loved her since a rainy night she didn't even remember, she finally understood that fate had a very particular sense of humor. Sometimes the prince in a fairy tale doesn't ride a white horse. Sometimes he is the darkness that has loved you from afar, waiting for the precise moment you need him most to step out into the light. If you're ready for this story, drop a heart and hit subscribe so you won't miss the next ones. Share this video with someone who needs to believe that sometimes being left behind is simply fate's way of leading us to the place we truly belong. The warm breath of the stranger brushed lightly against Rose's ear, and that deep voice rolled through her like thunder breaking over the storm that was already churning inside her. You don't remember me, but I remember you. 5 years ago, you saved me in a dark alley. Rose went perfectly still. 5 years ago? A dark alley? She clawed through her memory, but found nothing there except a blurred, unreachable haze. Where had she met this man? Why couldn't she remember? And yet, when she lifted her eyes to his, to that cold gray gaze, something strange surged in her chest. Familiar, as if her soul had known him long before her mind ever had the chance to name him. You have 2 choices, the man went on, his voice still low enough that only she could hear it beneath the crowd's restless whispering. 1, I take you out of here right now. No one is allowed to watch you cry for 1 more second. 2, you let me show them that you haven't been abandoned. Rose blinked. She didn't understand. How could a stranger make this entire church see that she hadn't been left behind? But before she could ask, Aunt Margaret's screaming rose again from the middle pews. My money! How much of my money did this wedding cost? You're going to take responsibility. Each bitter word struck like a blade against a wound that was still bleeding. Rose felt her knees threatening to give way. She'd endured enough. A decade under her aunt's roof, and 19 years of enduring pain since the day she lost everything. Beaten, starved, and locked away in a dark storage room. She had escaped, built a life with her bare hands, believed she'd finally found happiness. And now, in front of 150 people, she was being discarded again, like something worthless. Don't listen to her. The stranger's voice cut in, firmer this time, as if he were holding back something violent inside himself. You don't owe her anything. You don't owe anyone here anything. Rose looked up at him. In those icy gray eyes, she saw something that made her shiver. Not pity, not curiosity, protection, pure and fierce, as if this man would set the whole world on fire if anyone dared to hurt her one more time. "Why?" Rose whispered, her voice rough from fighting back tears. "Why are you helping me? Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. He only looked at her, and his gaze softened a fraction, as if he were looking at the most precious thing in the world. "I'll explain everything later, but right now, trust me, just this once." Rose didn't know why, but she did. Maybe because she had nothing left to lose. Maybe because there wasn't even a hint of a lie in those eyes. Or maybe because, deep in her subconscious, her soul recognized him from a rainy night her memory had buried. She nodded. Slowly, decisively, and the man smiled, not the smile of a victor, the smile of someone who had waited for this moment through 5 long, punishing years. As the realization of her new reality began to sink in, Elijah turned to face the entire church, and in that instant, the air seemed to freeze in place. He didn't need to raise his voice, yet that deep tone carried into every corner of the sanctuary, weighted with an authority that made people fall silent without thinking. "Please forgive the chaos you've just witnessed. The man who ran out of here isn't the real groom. He's an intruder, a jealous ex who came to ruin our wedding." A ripple of murmurs moved through the pews. 150 pairs of eyes shifted from confusion to shock, from shock to suspicion, and then from suspicion to a hungry kind of curiosity. But no one dared to challenge him. There was something about this man that made people afraid to breathe too loudly, let alone question him. "I'm Elijah Blackwood," he continued, as calm as if he were announcing the weather. "And Rosalie Bennett is my fiancée." The name cracked through the room like lightning in a clear sky. Blackwood, Aunt Margaret, who had been about to start screaming again, suddenly went pale, her lips pressing tight as if she'd swallowed something bitter. She knew that name. Who in Chicago didn't? The Blackwood family controlled half this city, from the legal glass towers that scraped the sky to the underground empires the police didn't dare touch. And the man standing before her was the kingpin of it all. Aunt Margaret sank back into her seat, not daring to utter another word. Rose stood there with her mind spinning. She wanted to shout that this was insanity, that she didn't even know this man, that the whole thing was some impossible, fever dream of a performance. But when she looked into Elijah's eyes, she saw him asking permission, not commanding, not forcing, asking her to let him protect her, if only for this moment. The old priest stood at the pulpit, his face drained by the shock of what had happened, looking awkwardly from Rose to Elijah and back again. "So, shall we continue?" Elijah looked at Rose. He didn't say a word. He only waited. The choice was still hers. And Rose, drowning in a storm of emotion, nodded. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know who this man was. But in the middle of humiliation and hurt closing in around her, he was the only lifeline within reach. The ceremony continued like a strange dream. The priest recited the vows, his voice trembling, still not fully recovered. When it came time to exchange rings, Rose realized she had no ring for Elijah, and the ring Brandon had prepared had vanished along with him. But Elijah calmly slid a hand into his suit pocket and took out a black velvet box. Inside was a diamond ring, so exquisitely made that Rose couldn't breathe. Not the loud, gaudy kind meant to show off. The kind of beauty that hurt, elegant and enduring, as though it had been crafted for her hand alone. "You had it ready?" Rose whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Elijah didn't answer. He only slipped the ring onto her finger with a gentleness that felt unreal, and Rose didn't know that he had bought this ring 3 years earlier, locked it away in his safe, waiting for a day he had never dared to believe would come. When the priest declared them husband and wife, Rose braced herself for a kiss. She closed her eyes, her heart hammering wildly. But those lips didn't meet hers. Instead, Elijah bent down and pressed a feather-light kiss to her forehead. Tender, respectful. As if she were the most precious treasure he didn't dare profane. Rose opened her eyes and met Elijah's gaze, and in that moment she saw something deep inside those cold gray eyes, something she couldn't name. They walked out of the church, hand in hand, beneath the golden afternoon sun of Chicago. A gleaming black Maybach waited outside, the driver in a black suit holding the door open with a bow. Rose stepped into the car like a sleepwalker, still unable to believe what had just happened. When the door shut, sealing them off from the outside world, Rose turned to the man sitting beside her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. Who are you really? Why are you doing all of this? Elijah was silent for a long time. Then he reached beneath the seat, took out a thick file, and placed it in her lap. Read it, then you'll understand why I had to save you from him. Rose opened the file with trembling hands, and as she read the very first lines, her world collapsed for the second time that day. The first page was a photograph of Brandon Mercer, but not the Brandon Rose thought she knew. In the picture, he had his arms around another woman, wearing the very same smile he used to give Rose. Beneath it was a different name and a different city. Rose turned to the next page. Another photograph, Brandon with another woman, then the next page, and the page after that. 6 women, 6 different cities, 6 fake names, and a professional con artist who had taken more than $500,000 from lonely hearts desperate to be loved. Rose's stomach lurched. She kept turning and found bank statements, formal complaints from prior victims, messages Brandon had sent to his accomplices, and when she reached one message in particular, her hands began to shake beyond her control. New target in Chicago. Poor but easy to believe. The naive type who waits for a prince to come save her. Easy as candy. A target. He had called her a target. Every sweet word, every surprise bouquet, every gentle kiss, every promise of a happy future, all of it had been a carefully calculated performance, designed to trap a lonely girl who was desperate for love. Rose turned to the final pages, and her heart felt like it was being crushed. Brandon owed a gang $200,000, a staggering amount he couldn't repay. And by law, if they married, Rose would become the one responsible for that debt. He hadn't only lied about his feelings. He planned to use her name to shield his crimes, leaving her as the primary target for his dangerous debt collectors. The file slipped from Rose's hands. She no longer had the strength to hold it. Tears poured as if a dam had broken, but there was no sound of sobbing, only silent streams running down her cheeks, falling onto the wedding dress she had altered stitch by stitch, with so much hope and so many daydreams. For 27 years, Rose had grown used to being left behind. Her parents had left her when they died on that fateful Christmas night. Aunt Margaret had left her through cruelty and coldness for 10 years. And now the man she had believed was true love had left her too, in the most brutal way imaginable. She had trusted the wrong person, again. She had handed her heart to someone unworthy, again. She had dreamed of happiness and reality had slapped her across the face. Again. Elijah sat in silence beside her. He watched Rose cry, and his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to hold her, to pull her against him and tell her everything would be all right, to wipe away the tears blurring the fragile makeup on that beautiful face. But he didn't dare. He had no right. He was only a stranger who had appeared without warning on the worst day of her life. He couldn't touch her without permission, even though his own heart was breaking as he watched her suffer. Even though he had waited 5 years just to be this close to her. After a long stretch of silence, Rose lifted her head. Her green eyes, swollen and red from crying, looked straight into Elijah's. "How did you know all of this?" she asked, her voice thick and hoarse. "How do you have this file? How do you know about him?" "About me?" Elijah met her stare without blinking. He knew the answer would frighten her. It might disgust her, but he had sworn to himself he would never lie to her, no matter how brutal the truth might be. "Because I've been watching you for 5 years. Rose. Her eyes widened in shock, but before she could react, Elijah went on, his voice dropping lower, as if he were speaking of the most sacred memory of his life. 5 years ago, there was a rainy night. I went down in a dark alley, bleeding without stopping, thinking I was going to die. People walked past. No one stopped. No one even looked, but one girl stopped. She knelt beside me, tore her own shirt to bandage my wound, called an ambulance, and held my hand the entire time we waited." Elijah paused, and for the first time, Rose saw something shift inside those cold gray eyes. She said one thing to me that I've never forgotten. She said, "Don't give up." Rose stopped breathing. A memory from 5 years earlier began to rise from the hidden corners of her mind. A rainy night, a dark alley near Old Pete's place. A man covered in blood she had assumed was homeless. "That girl was you, Rose. And from that night on, I searched for you. And I never stopped watching you. 5 years ago, Chicago was drowning in the worst storm of the decade. Rain poured down like a waterfall. Wind screamed through empty streets, and darkness swallowed every corner of the city. Elijah Blackwood, 31 years old, was lying in a filthy alley behind an abandoned warehouse district, blood from a wound in his abdomen mixing with rainwater and running in a dark red stream across the ground. He'd been betrayed. The man he trusted most, his right hand for 10 years, had sold him out to the enemy for money and a promise of power. The ambush happened too fast. 2 bullets tore into his stomach before Elijah could react. He'd shot down 3 attackers, but the wound was too severe. He staggered for several blocks before collapsing in this dark alley. The rain felt like needles against skin, but Elijah couldn't feel it anymore. His body was going numb. His awareness was fading, little by little. He stared up at the pitch-black sky and thought this was probably the end. 31 years living in darkness, building an empire with blood and iron, only to die in a stinking alley like a stray dog. Maybe this was the ending a man like him deserved. People did pass by. Even in the heavy rain, silhouettes hurried past the mouth of the alley. A few glanced in, saw him there, and turned away faster. No one stopped. No one called an ambulance. No one cared about a blood-soaked man lying in trash. To them, he was just a drunk homeless man or a dying addict. Better to stay away. Don't make trouble for yourself. Elijah gave a quiet, bitter laugh in his throat. All his life he'd lived among people who calculated everything. People who came close only for money, for power, for fear. No one stayed because they truly wanted to, and now, as he was about to die, no one would even pause for a second. Just as his consciousness was about to blink out completely, Elijah heard footsteps running toward him. Then a clear voice rang out, frantic with worry. "Oh my God, are you okay? Can you hear me?" A warm hand touched his face. Elijah forced his eyes open and saw a face bending over him. A young woman, maybe only in her 20s, dark brown hair soaked through, plastered to her cheeks by the rain. But what stole Elijah's breath was her eyes, green, bright as emeralds, and filled with worry for a stranger she'd never met. She didn't scream in fear at the sight of blood. She didn't turn and run like everyone else. Instead, she dropped to her knees right beside him, not caring that the dirty puddle soaked through her cheap jeans. She pulled off the thin jacket she was wearing, wadded it up, and pressed it hard against the wound in his abdomen to stop the bleeding. "Don't close your eyes. Do you hear me? Don't close your eyes," she shouted as she grabbed her phone and called 911. Her voice shook as she gave the address, but her hands kept the jacket pressed tight to his wound, steady and unflinching. When she finished the call, she threw the phone aside and took Elijah's hand. Her hand was small and icy from the rain, but to him it was the only warmth in this pitch-dark night. "The ambulance is coming. You have to hold on. Do you hear me?" Elijah wanted to say something, but he couldn't form the words. All he could do was look at her. Look at those green eyes shining with tears because she was frightened for a stranger. Who was she? Why did she stop when the whole world walked past? Why was she crying for a blood-soaked man she didn't even know? "Don't give up," she said, her voice thick with tears but firm. "Do you hear me? Whoever you are, whatever happened to you, don't give up. Keep living, keep fighting, don't give up." Those 3 words pierced the fog of his fading mind and carved themselves into Elijah like a curse, like a promise, like a rope pulling him back from the edge of death. He looked into her eyes one last time before darkness swallowed him whole. Green eyes, full of worry, full of sincerity, not a trace of calculation. For the first time in his life, someone saved Elijah Blackwood and asked for nothing in return. She didn't know who he was. She didn't need to know whether he could repay her. She saved him because she couldn't walk away from a dying man. When Elijah woke in the hospital 3 days later, the first thing he did was order them to find that girl. He had to know who she was. He had to find her. He had to see those green eyes one more time. And when Harrison placed the file on Rosalie Bennett on his desk, when Elijah read her life story, the cold heart of Chicago's kingpin learned what pain was for the first time. The file on Rosalie Bennett was more than 50 pages thick. Harrison had spent 2 weeks gathering every piece of information he could about the young woman who had saved his boss's life on that fateful rainy night. Elijah sat alone in his office, the soft yellow glow of a desk lamp falling across the paper, and he began to read. The first pages told the story of a small family in the suburbs of Chicago. Rose's father, Thomas Bennett, was an honest mechanic who worked 12 hours a day in a small garage to keep his family afloat. Her mother, Elizabeth Bennett, was a night shift nurse at the local hospital, a gentle woman who always came home carrying stories about the patients she'd helped. They weren't wealthy. The apartment they rented had only 2 tiny bedrooms. The furniture was worn, and in winter the heater broke down often. But in the photographs Harrison had found, Elijah saw a happy family. He saw the bright smile of little Rose in her parents' arms. He saw simple dinners filled with laughter. He saw a pure kind of love no amount of money could ever buy. Elijah turned to the next pages, and the air in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Christmas night, 19 years earlier. The Bennett family was on their way home after a party at a friend's house. Snow was falling thickly. The roads were slick, and a truck lost control and slammed straight into their car. Thomas and Elizabeth died at the scene. Rose, 8 years old in the back seat, survived with only a few minor scratches, but carried a wound that would never heal. A child lost her parents on the night that was supposed to be the happiest of the year. Elijah stared at the accident scene photo in the police report. The car crushed nearly flat. Glass scattered across white snow stained with blood. He couldn't imagine what an 8-year-old had endured. Witnessing that, sitting inside that wreckage waiting to be rescued, beside the cooling bodies of her parents. After the funeral, Rose was handed over to the only family member she had left, Margaret Bennett, her mother's sister. Elijah kept reading, and his jaw tightened a little more with every line. Margaret didn't love her niece. She took Rose in only for the insurance money her parents had left behind, and as that money slowly ran out, her cruelty showed itself more and more openly. Rose wasn't treated like family. She was unpaid help, cooking, washing, cleaning, caring for her aunt's 2 sons while she herself still wasn't tall enough to reach the kitchen sink. She wasn't allowed a bedroom. Her place was a storage space under the stairs, cramped and lightless, barely big enough for a thin mattress and an old blanket. The photographs in the file showed Rose during her school years, thin and pale, wearing old, torn clothes, her eyes always lowered as if she were afraid of the entire world. There were notes from school staff saying she often arrived with bruises on her arms and legs. There were reports from teachers worried she was being abused. But every time anyone asked, Rose said she'd fallen. No one intervened. No one pulled that little girl out of hell. Elijah turned to a page with a photograph of Rose at 10 years old, and he noticed one detail that made his heart ache. Around her neck was a silver necklace, with a tiny heart pendant. The note beside it said it was the only keepsake of her mother Rose had managed to hold on to. Aunt Margaret had taken everything else: clothes, jewelry, wedding photographs, mementos, sold it all for spending money. But Rose had hidden this necklace. She slept with it every night, clutching the small silver heart against her chest as if she were holding her mother. When Rose turned 18, Aunt Margaret threw her out. No reason, no explanation. Simply because she no longer wanted to keep her once Rose was old enough to be considered grown. Rose walked out of that house with a worn backpack, $47 she'd managed to save over the years, the only photograph of her parents she still possessed, and the silver heart necklace around her neck. Nowhere to go, no one to turn to. An 18-year-old girl, alone in a city, vast and cold. She wandered for 3 days, sleeping in parks, eating whatever she could find in restaurant dumpsters, until an old man named Pete, the owner of a small diner, saw her digging through the trash behind his place. Instead of chasing her off, he invited her inside, gave her a hot meal, and asked if she wanted to work. From that point on, Rose began a new life, waiting tables by day, cleaning offices at night, saving every dollar she could to rent a tiny room in the worst part of the city. 9 years passed, and she lived that way, alone, lonely, but still keeping her smile, still kind to the people around her, still willing to stop for a dying stranger in a dark alley. Elijah closed the file and sat motionless in the dark. All his life, he hadn't cried. Even when his mother was killed in front of him when he was 10, not a single tear had fallen. Tears were a luxury a Mafia kingpin wasn't allowed to have. But tonight, reading the story of that young woman's life, Elijah felt his eyes burn. The girl who had saved him in the rain, the girl who had held his hand and said, "Don't give up," the girl with those sincere green eyes, was lonelier than he was, more wounded than he was, treated more cruelly by life than he had ever been. And still, she hadn't turned bitter. She hadn't lost her kindness. She was still willing to give love to others even though she herself had received so little. Elijah stood, walked to the window, and looked out at Chicago, drowning in night. He pressed a hand to his chest, where his heart was beating in a strange way he'd never felt before. And in that darkness, the kingpin of Chicago's largest underground empire made a vow to himself. He would protect her, at any cost, even if she never knew he existed. 5 years is a long time, long enough for an empire to change, long enough for wounds to heal. But for Elijah Blackwood, 5 years was only 5 years spent standing quietly in the shadows, watching a girl he didn't dare approach. He knew everything about Rose's life. He knew she woke at 5 o'clock every morning to make it to her shift at Old Pete's Diner. He knew she often bought a cheap cup of coffee from the self-serve counter on the corner because she couldn't afford the nicer cafes. He knew she liked to read fairy tales on her rare days off, sitting alone on a park bench near her rented room. He knew she still wore her mother's silver heart necklace every day, never taking it off, and he protected her in his own way. Rose's room was in an old, worn apartment building, and the landlord was a greedy man who raised the rent whenever he felt like it. 1 month after Elijah began watching Rose, the landlord suddenly announced the rent would be cut in half. No explanation. No reason. Rose was shocked and grateful, thinking she'd simply gotten lucky. She didn't know Elijah had bought the entire building and ordered that her rent must never be raised, not by even a single cent. One winter night, when Rose was coming home late from work, a drunk man blocked her path in an empty alley. He grabbed her wrist, his breath spilling filth and threats. Rose screamed and fought, but she couldn't break free. She didn't know that less than 50 meters away, Elijah was sitting inside a black car, his fist clenched so hard his nails dug into his palm until it bled. He wanted to burst out immediately, to crush the throat of the man who dared lay a hand on her. But if he appeared, Rose would know someone had been watching her. She would be afraid. She would panic. He couldn't let that happen. Luckily, Rose's screams drew the attention of passers-by, and the drunk ran before he could do anything more. The next night, that man disappeared from Chicago. No one knew what happened to him. No one found a body, and Rose went on living her ordinary life, never realizing the darkness had swallowed the man who meant to harm her. That wasn't the only time Elijah acted from the shadows. A co-worker at the office cleaning job who liked to grope Rose was suddenly fired and couldn't find work anywhere in the city. A thug who often loitered outside Old Pete's Diner picking fights abruptly moved away after a single night. 3 men who had made Rose cry, who had exploited her kindness, who had hurt her, all 3 ran into serious trouble that ensured their lives would never be the same. Elijah didn't only watch Rose, he built an invisible world around her, a world where no one could hurt her without paying a price. In his estate outside Chicago, Elijah set aside one corner of the garden for roses. He tended every bloom with his own hands each Sunday morning, the only thing he did with his hands instead of issuing orders to someone else. When Harrison asked why his boss cared about a flower garden at all, Elijah only said it carried the name of someone special. Rose Garden, her name. One night, Harrison came to Elijah's office, his face tight with worry. He didn't understand why his boss, the most powerful man in Chicago, would spend hours every night sitting in a car just to stare at a tiny rented room in the city's poorest neighborhood. "Boss, why don't you approach her? With your power, you can have anything you want." Elijah didn't look at him. He was still staring at Rose's photo on the computer screen, a picture of her smiling at a customer inside Old Pete's Diner. "You don't understand, Harrison. I'm a monster. She's light. If I get close, I'll only drag her into the dark. I'll stain her purity. I can't do that." Harrison fell silent. After all these years working for Elijah, this was the first time he'd heard his boss speak of someone in that tone. Soft, painful, and hopeless. In the nights that followed, Elijah kept returning to the street where Rose lived. He didn't go inside, didn't knock, didn't let her know he existed. He only stood in the darkness across from her window, watching yellow lamplight spill through the thin curtain, and imagined what she might be doing inside. Maybe she was reading. Maybe she was eating dinner alone. Maybe she was crying from loneliness and no one knew. And Elijah would stay there until the light went out, until he knew she had safely slipped into sleep. And only then would he return to his empty estate. 4 years passed like that. Elijah accepted that he would love her from a distance forever. That he would be the darkness guarding the light, never allowed to touch it. Until one day, Harrison walked into his office with a fresh set of photographs. "Boss, there's a new man showing up beside her." Elijah snatched the photos. In them, Rose was smiling brightly beside a handsome man with a perfect smile. The man was offering her a single red rose, and she was looking at him as if he were the prince who had stepped out of the fairy tales she'd always dreamed of. Elijah stared at the picture. Then he looked at the name written beneath it, Brandon Mercer, and for the first time in his life, the kingpin of Chicago's underground empire learned what it meant to be driven mad by jealousy. The total he'd taken climbed to more than $500,000. And now, his next target was Rose. When Elijah finished reading the report, he sat in silence in his office for 3 full hours, his hands clenched until his knuckles went white. In his mind, there was only one thought: kill. Kill Brandon Mercer. Kill him in the most painful way possible. Bury him where no one would ever find him. With Elijah's power, it would have been as easy as turning his hand. But then he thought of Rose. He thought of her smile when she was with Brandon. He thought of the hopeful sparkle in her eyes every time she said the man's name. She was happy. For the first time after so many years of loneliness, she believed she'd found love. If Elijah killed Brandon now, Rose would suffer. She would cry. She would wonder why the man she loved had disappeared. And that kind of pain would kill Elijah, day after day. She looks at him the way she looks at a fairy tale prince, Elijah told Harrison, his voice bitter. I can't shatter her dream, even if that dream was built by a con man. Harrison said nothing. He only stood there, watching his boss suffer for a woman he hadn't even spoken to. Love was strange. It could turn a cold Mafia kingpin into someone willing to endure any agony just so the person he loved could be happy, even if that happiness was a lie. Elijah decided to wait. He told himself he might be wrong, that maybe Brandon truly loved Rose, maybe the man had changed because of her. If it was true, if Brandon really gave Rose happiness, Elijah would let go. He would retreat into the shadows and let her live the life she deserved. But 6 months later, Brandon proposed to Rose, and when Harrison brought the news, Elijah surged to his feet and smashed his heavy oak desk to pieces. The wood splintered beneath his fist. Blood ran from the cuts on his hand, but he didn't feel the pain. The pain in his chest was 1,000 times worse. Harrison stood there, and for the first time in 15 years working for Elijah, he saw his boss lose control completely. Boss, get out. Elijah's voice was ice. Get out. Now. Harrison left without another word, and Elijah stood alone amid the wreckage of the desk, staring down at the photograph of Rose smiling brightly beside Brandon, the engagement ring glittering on her finger. He had lost. Lost to a cheap con artist. Lost because he'd been too cowardly to step into the light. Lost because he'd locked himself in the dark and let someone else take the woman he loved. In the weeks that followed, Elijah moved like a corpse. He still ran the empire, still gave orders, still controlled everything, but his eyes were empty. Harrison knew his boss was dying from the inside out. Rose's wedding day arrived. Elijah put on a black suit and drove to the small church on the outskirts of Chicago. He sat in the last pew, the darkest corner, where no one would notice him. He came to see her one last time, to watch her walk down the aisle in white, to watch her speak vows to another man, to watch her happy, even if that happiness was an illusion. Then he would leave. Leave Chicago. Leave her life forever. Rose stepped into the church, breathtaking in the wedding dress she had altered with her own hands. Elijah looked at her and swallowed every detail of her into his heart, knowing this was the last time. The ceremony began. The priest spoke the familiar words. And then, that fateful moment came. Brandon's phone rang. He looked at the screen, his face turning gray. Then, without saying a single word, he turned and ran out of the church. Elijah watched Rose standing there, alone, abandoned in front of everyone. And in that instant, every thought of leaving vanished. He rose. He stepped out of the shadows. He walked toward the light that had filled his soul for 5 years. This was the moment he had to step forward. This was the moment the darkness had to protect the light, not from far away anymore, but right beside it. The black Maybach glided through Chicago's busy streets and then rolled into the quiet suburbs. Rose sat in silence by the window, watching the scenery shift from tall buildings to lush green trees and wide, open fields. She still couldn't believe what had happened today. This morning she'd been a happy bride, ready to step into a new life. Now she was in a car with a stranger, a diamond ring on her hand that she didn't know the origin of, carrying the title of wife to a man she didn't even know. When the car stopped in front of a massive iron gate, Rose looked up and caught her breath. Beyond the gate stood a sprawling estate, larger than any home she'd ever seen in her life. Towering white stone columns, a classical dome, stained glass windows sparkling under warm yellow lights. All around it were meticulously trimmed gardens, a marble fountain, and a fence of deep red roses stretching on as if it could never end. Rose had seen houses like this in movies, in magazines, in dreams she didn't dare to dream. But she had never imagined she would set foot in a place like this. Her tiny rented room could have fit into one corner of the main hall. Elijah led her inside, past long corridors lined with oil paintings and crystal chandeliers glittering overhead. Servants bowed as they passed, but no one looked surprised to see their master bringing home an unfamiliar girl in a wrinkled wedding dress. They stopped in front of an oak door at the end of the second-floor hallway. Elijah opened it and stepped aside so Rose could look in. The room was vast, decorated in soft white and pale pink. A king-size bed with immaculate white linens, a white wooden vanity, a closet large enough to be its own room, and tall windows overlooking the rose garden behind the estate. "This is your room from now on," Elijah said, his voice deep but gentle. "You have full access to everything in this house, but I want you to know one thing." He paused, looking straight into her eyes. "I will never step into this room without your permission. Even though we've had a wedding, even though on paper you are my wife, this is your private space. No one is allowed to violate it." Rose looked at him, unsure whether to believe it. She had heard too many promises in her life, and every one of them had been a lie. But something in Elijah's gaze made her want to believe, a sincerity she hadn't found in Brandon even after 6 months with him. That night, Rose couldn't sleep. She lay on the softest bed she had ever known, staring up at a ceiling that felt impossibly far away, wondering where her life had turned. The next morning, when Rose came down to the dining room, she saw breakfast already set on the table. Pancakes with maple syrup, eggs cooked just right, crisp bacon, and a glass of fresh orange juice. It was exactly her favorite breakfast, exactly the way she liked it. Rose went still. She had never told Elijah what she liked to eat, so how did he know? How did the staff know what to make for her? A chill ran down her spine. He knew too much about her, more than what was normal, more than what someone she'd only just met could possibly know. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Rose looked at the screen and saw old Pete's name. She answered quickly, and the old man's trembling voice came through the line. "Rose, are you okay? Where are you? I heard you left with some strange man after the wedding." "I'm okay, Pete. I'm somewhere safe." "Safe? Do you even know who that man is?" "Elijah Blackwood. Do you know what that name means in Chicago?" Rose fell silent. She didn't know. "Google it, kid. Look it up right now. Then you'll understand why I'm this worried." After she hung up, Rose did exactly what old Pete had said. She typed Elijah Blackwood into the search bar, and the results hit her like lightning. Elijah Blackwood, head of the Blackwood Empire, one of the 50 richest people in the United States. On the surface, a businessman who owned a long list of real estate companies, hotels, casinos, but underneath, according to rumors and investigative articles, the kingpin of the largest underground network in Chicago. The port, gambling rings, shadow deals the police didn't dare touch. People called him the King of Darkness. Rose read line after line, her hands shaking. She was in the house of a mafia boss. She carried the name of wife to one of the most dangerous men in this city. What had she done with her life? That evening, when Elijah returned after a day of work, Rose was waiting for him in the living room. She stood as he walked in, her green eyes locked on his gray ones, unblinking. "Are you Mafia?" Elijah stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. No denial, no excuses, no evasion. "Yes." Rose drew a deep breath. She had prepared herself to hear it. But when the word was actually spoken, it still felt like a fist to her stomach. "Then why did you save me? What do you want from me?" Elijah stepped closer, but kept enough distance that she wouldn't feel threatened. "I don't want anything from you, Rose. I only want to protect you, the way I've protected you for 5 years, without you ever knowing." And then he told her what he'd done for her in silence, told her about the men who had disappeared because they dared to hurt her, told her why he knew her favorite food, knew what she liked to read, knew how she cried alone in her room on lonely nights. When Elijah finished, Rose stood there, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't know whether to be afraid or moved. She didn't know whether to run or stay. But there was one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't walk away. The vast living room sank into a heavy silence. Rose stood facing Elijah, tears still clinging to her cheeks. But those green eyes looked straight at him without the slightest flinch. She needed the truth, all of it, no matter how frightening it might be. "You said you're Mafia," she said, her voice trembling but forcing itself to hold steady. "So what have you done? Have you killed people?" Elijah didn't avoid her gaze. He had sworn he would never lie to her, and he would keep that vow even if the truth drove her away from him forever. "I control the port of Chicago. Everything that goes in and out passes through my hands. I own 6 casinos, legal on the surface, but behind them are deals the law can't reach. I have people everywhere, in the police, in government, in business. Nothing happens in this city without me knowing." He stopped and drew a slow breath. "And yes, I've killed people. I have blood on my hands. Not 1 life or 2, but more than I can count. I'm not a good man, Rose. I've never claimed to be." Rose felt her knees wanting to buckle. She was standing in front of a killer, a criminal kingpin, a monster wearing a human face. Every instinct in her screamed at her to run far away, to never look back. But her feet wouldn't move. "However," Elijah continued, his voice softening slightly, "I've never lied to you, and I won't start now. You deserve to know the truth about the man standing in front of you, even if that truth is ugly." Rose swallowed hard. She wanted to flee, to get away from this place, from this man, from every insane thing that had happened today. As if he could read her thoughts, Elijah took a step back, giving her more space. "You can leave any time you want, Rose. Right now, if you want. I'll give you money, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life without working. I'll buy you a house anywhere you choose, far from Chicago, far from me. I'll send people to protect you from a distance, so no one can ever hurt you. You don't owe me anything." Rose stared at him, stunned. She had braced herself for anything, for threats, for coercion, for sweet words meant to trap her here. She hadn't braced herself for this, for freedom placed in her hands with nothing demanded in return. "Why?" she asked, the word barely more than a breath. "Why are you doing all of this? You could have any woman you want, richer than me, prettier than me, someone from your world. Why me? A broke waitress from the slums?" Elijah was silent for a long moment. Then he moved to the window and looked out at the rose garden drowning in night. 5 years ago, I was a monster, dying in a dark alley. Not dying from the wound in my body, but dying because I'd lost every last bit of faith in people. I was betrayed by the man I trusted most. I watched dozens of people walk past without stopping. I thought this world was nothing but selfish men and women, people who only ever cared about themselves. He turned back to her. "Then you appeared, a young woman, clearly poor, clearly struggling to survive. But you stopped. You knelt beside me, tore your own clothes to bandage a stranger you didn't know was dangerous, didn't know was anything at all. You held my hand and said, 'Don't give up.'" Elijah's voice shook, and Rose realized it was the first time she had seen real feeling on that cold, controlled face. "You saved me that night, Rose. Not my life, my soul. You showed me there are still good people in this world. People who will help a stranger without asking for anything. And from that night on, every day I watched you live, watched you smile, watched you stay kind to everyone around you, even after life had been cruel to you. I remembered I didn't have to become a monster completely. You are my light, Rose. You're the reason I still have a shred of humanity left." Rose's tears spilled over without control. In 27 years, no one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever truly seen her. To Aunt Margaret, she had been a burden. To Brandon, she had been prey. To the world, she had been an invisible girl no one cared about. But to the man standing in front of her, she was light. The reason he held on to what was human inside him, the most important person, even though she had never done anything to deserve it. "You can go right now," Elijah repeated. "I won't stop you. I won't resent you. I only want you to be happy, whether that happiness includes me or not." Rose wiped her tears. She looked at the man before her, a Mafia kingpin with blood on his hands, Chicago's monster, and yet also the only person in her life who had told her the truth. All of it. Even when the truth was ugly. She thought of Brandon, who had lied to her about everything with a perfect smile. She thought of Aunt Margaret, who had hidden cruelty behind the mask of family. She thought of all the people who had treated her as if she didn't deserve respect. Then she thought of Elijah, the man who had told the truth, the man who had given her a choice, the man who demanded nothing from her. "I'll stay," Rose said, her voice small but certain. "Not because I love you. I don't love you. I don't even know who you are. But for the first time in my life, someone told me the truth even when it was terrifying, and I want to know more. I want to understand more. About you. About all of this." Elijah looked at her, and in those cold gray eyes, Rose saw something flicker. Not joy, not victory. Hope. The fragile hope of a man who had waited too long in the dark. The weeks that followed passed in polite distance. They lived in the same estate, but like strangers. Elijah left for work each day. Rose stayed behind alone, exploring the enormous house. They ate dinner together every evening, but their conversation stayed on ordinary things. The weather, the meal, the books Rose was reading. But every night, when Rose looked out from her bedroom window, she saw a figure standing in the rose garden. Elijah stood there, alone in the darkness, watching her window for hours until she turned off the light to sleep. He didn't come inside. He didn't knock. He didn't disturb her. He only stood there, as if seeing the glow from her room was enough to let him breathe. And each night like that, Rose asked herself a question she couldn't answer. Was that man a monster, or was he something else entirely? In the weeks that followed, Rose began to notice the small details she'd overlooked before. Elijah Blackwood wasn't only the cold Mafia kingpin the press had painted. He was also a human being, full of hidden corners no one was allowed to see. Except her. One night, Rose went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water and passed Elijah's office by accident. The door was slightly open, warm yellow light spilling into the hallway. She meant to keep walking, but curiosity stopped her, and she looked in. Elijah was sitting in an armchair by the window, a book in his hands. But it wasn't a business book or a stack of work files the way she expected. He was reading poetry. Pablo Neruda. His voice was low and soft, reading each line and each word with the reverence of someone who truly loved literature. Rose stood there and listened to him finish the entire poem without daring to move. She hadn't expected hands that had killed to be able to turn pages with such gentleness. Every Sunday morning, Elijah woke early and went into the kitchen to cook. The estate had 3 professional chefs. Anything could be prepared in an instant. But Sundays were the day Elijah cooked with his own hands. He made simple things: fried eggs, toast, chicken soup, with the focus and care of a man treating it like the most important work in the world. Once, when Rose asked why, Elijah only smiled and said it was the only thing that made him feel normal in the middle of this insane life. Then Rose discovered Elijah's secret schedule each week. Every Wednesday afternoon, he vanished from the estate for about 3 hours. No one knew where he went, not even Harrison. One time, Rose decided to follow him. She saw the black Maybach stop in front of an old nursing home at the edge of the city. Elijah went inside without bodyguards, without an entourage, just him. Rose stood outside and watched through the glass. She saw Elijah sit beside an elderly woman with snow-white hair, take her hand, and talk with her for hours. He visited other seniors too, people with no family, no one who came to see them, forgotten by the world. The most feared Mafia kingpin in Chicago was sitting there reading the newspaper aloud to a blind old man and helping another elderly woman eat her porridge because her hands shook too badly to hold a spoon. When Rose asked Harrison about those secret trips, the most loyal man in Elijah's life told her a story she would never forget. The boss's mother was killed when he was 10, Harrison said, his voice lowering. His father's enemies took her hostage and murdered her right in front of him. The boss had to watch his mother die and couldn't do a thing. That's why he became the man he is today. Cold, ruthless, ready to destroy anyone who threatens the people he cares about. Harrison paused and looked out the window. But after that day, the boss swore an oath. He swore he would never let anyone endure the kind of pain he endured. That nursing home, he's funded it quietly for 15 years. No one knows where the money comes from. He also sends anonymous donations to dozens of schools in the poorest parts of the city, pays tuition for hundreds of orphan children, builds shelter homes for the homeless. All of it anonymous. He doesn't want anyone to know. He doesn't want credit or thanks. He only wants there to be a little less suffering in this world. Rose listened and couldn't find any words. She had thought she understood Elijah, thought he was nothing but a crime boss with a dark past. But she'd been wrong. He was a man of contradictions, both darkness and light, both monster and angel, depending on the angle she looked from. That night, Rose couldn't sleep. She stood by the window as usual, looking down at the rose garden, waiting to see Elijah's silhouette beneath it. But tonight something was different. The clock read 2 in the morning when she finally saw him. Elijah stood among the roses, alone in the dark. But he wasn't still the way he usually was. His shoulders were shaking. His whole body was trembling as if he were enduring a pain too deep to speak aloud. Rose opened the glass door and listened. In the hush of the night, she heard a sound she never thought she would hear. Crying. Elijah Blackwood, the kingpin of Chicago's underground empire, the man the entire city feared, was standing alone in a rose garden and crying like a child. Rose wanted to know why, and she knew the answer would change everything between them. Rose didn't think. She threw on a thin robe and ran down the stairs, across the living room, and pushed open the glass doors leading to the garden. The grass was soaked with the cold night dew beneath her bare feet, but she didn't care. She only wanted to reach the man standing alone among dark red roses in the darkness. Elijah heard her footsteps and turned. When he saw Rose, he quickly looked away, lifting a hand to wipe the tears still clinging to his cheeks. But it was too late. She'd seen everything. "You should go back inside. It's cold tonight." His voice was rough, trying to sound steady, failing badly. Rose didn't turn back. She stepped closer, until she was right beside him, looking up at the face that was trying to hide its weakness. "Why are you crying?" Elijah didn't answer. He stared up at the star-filled sky, his jaw clenched as if he were forcing down the emotion rising inside him. But Rose didn't give up. She stayed there, silent, letting him know she wasn't going anywhere. Finally, Elijah spoke. "Today is my mother's death anniversary." His voice was barely a whisper in the night. 26 years ago, on this exact day, I watched my mother die right in front of me. I was 10. I couldn't do anything to save her. I could only stand there and watch. He stopped, swallowing hard. 26 years. Every year, when this day comes, I come out here and stand alone, because I have no one to share it with. No one who truly cares. The people around me, they stay for money, for power, for fear. No one stays because they want to. No one looks at me like a human being. I'm the boss. I'm a monster. I'm a tool for them to get what they want. But I'm not someone worthy of being loved. Rose felt her heart tightening until it hurt to breathe. 26 years of loneliness. 26 years with no one truly beside him. 26 years standing alone in the dark, crying for a mother he'd lost, with no one to hold his hand. She understood that feeling. She'd lived with it for 19 years since her parents died. A loneliness that went numb, an emptiness that choked, the sense that no matter how many people were around, you were still completely alone. Without thinking, Rose reached out and took Elijah's hand. He flinched, looked down at their fingers interlaced, then looked up at her with stunned eyes. It was the first time she had chosen to touch him. "I'm here not for your money," Rose said, her voice gentle but certain. "And I'm not afraid of you. I'm here because I want to be. And tonight, you don't have to be alone anymore." Elijah looked at her as if she had said something impossible. And maybe, for him, it truly was impossible. All his life, no one had ever spoken to him like that. They stood there in the rose garden, hand in hand, in silence until the sky began to lighten. No more words were needed. Their presence was enough. That night, Rose fell asleep with a strange feeling inside her. She felt a connection to Elijah she couldn't explain. But her sleep wasn't peaceful. Nightmares came like black waves. She dreamed she was 8 again, locked in the dark storage room under the stairs. Aunt Margaret stood outside, screaming, pounding the door, threatening to beat her if she dared to cry. She curled into the corner, clutching her mother's necklace, shaking in the dark. Rose screamed. The scream tore through the stillness of the estate, ripping the peace apart. She thrashed in bed, tears streaming down her cheeks, calling for her mother like a lost child. The bedroom door flew open. Elijah rushed in, not thinking, not remembering his vow that he would never enter her room without permission. He only knew she was hurting, and he couldn't bear it. He sat on the bed, pulled her into his arms, and held her tight. "You're safe now. I'm here. No one can hurt you. You're safe now." He repeated it like a spell, one hand stroking her hair, the other holding her against his chest. Rose slowly surfaced from the dream. She opened her eyes and found herself in Elijah's arms. His warm breath brushed her hair. His heartbeat sounded steady beside her ear. And instead of fear, instead of the urge to pull away, she felt something she hadn't felt in 19 years. Safety. She didn't speak. She only closed her eyes and let him hold her. Elijah didn't speak either. He held her through the night, never letting go, until the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains. The next morning, Rose woke and realized she was still in his arms. Elijah had fallen asleep at some point, his face strangely peaceful, no longer wearing its usual cold vigilance. She looked at him, and she didn't want to move. No fear, no confusion, only warmth and quiet peace spreading through her chest. And Rose knew something was changing between them, something she didn't dare name. The next 3 months passed like a dream Rose didn't want to wake from. Everything between her and Elijah was changing day by day. Little by little, the way the roses in the garden quietly bloomed without anyone noticing. It began when Elijah offered to teach her self-defense. He said that no matter how many bodyguards were around, she still needed to know how to protect herself when it mattered. Rose agreed, and every morning they spent 2 hours in the estate's gym. Elijah patiently guided her through every move: how to stand, how to shift her weight, how to throw a proper punch. And every time he corrected her posture, his hand touching her waist, her shoulder, her arm, Rose felt a current of electricity rush through her. She knew he felt it too, because every time it happened, his gray eyes darkened slightly, and he stepped back as if he were afraid he might lose control. Every evening, they walked through the rose garden. No invitations were needed. At 7 o'clock, both of them simply stepped outside, and they walked together between rows of fragrant blooms. They talked for hours, about everything and about nothing at all. Rose told him about the fairy tales her mother used to read to her before bed. Elijah told her about the poems he loved and why. They argued about what happiness meant, about life, about dreams they'd both once believed they didn't deserve. One afternoon, Rose was walking in the garden when she heard a child's laughter coming from the direction of the shed. Curious, she followed the sound and went still at what she saw. Elijah was holding the gardener's 3-year-old daughter in his arms, spinning her in the air while the little girl shrieked with giggles, and Elijah was laughing too. A bright, unguarded laugh, pure, with not a trace of weight or worry. The laugh of an ordinary man, not a Mafia kingpin, not a killer, just a man playing with a child. Rose watched him and felt her heart stutter. She had never seen him laugh like that, and she realized she wanted to see that smile every day. Elijah began learning to cook the things Rose loved. Every Sunday morning, alongside the dishes he always made, new ones started appearing, things she had mentioned only in passing during their conversations. Apple pie from her mother's recipe, pumpkin soup she remembered from childhood, ginger cookies she loved in winter. He didn't say a word, only placed the food on the table and watched her eat with a quiet, satisfied look. One day, Rose stumbled upon Elijah's private library, a vast room lined with thousands of books from floor to ceiling. She walked along the shelves, her fingertips skimming the spines, until she stopped at one particular corner. Fairy tales. Dozens of fairy tale books from all over the world, rare editions, hardcovers with gold embossed details, kept as carefully as treasures. Rose took one down and opened it. On the first page, in black ink, there was a handwritten line. For Rose, who believes in fairy tales. And beneath it was a date from 4 years earlier. Tears flooded Rose's eyes. 4 years earlier, when she didn't even know Elijah existed, he had bought these books for her. He had known she loved fairy tales, and had quietly collected them one by one, waiting for a day he could give them to her. His feelings for her hadn't begun at the disastrous wedding. They had been there for 5 years, silent and patient, like the roses that kept blooming every day whether anyone admired them or not. Winter came. Snow covered the garden and the entire estate in white. One night, as they sat by the fireplace in the living room, watching snow fall through the windows, Rose suddenly spoke. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said, her voice trembling, "and I'm scared." Elijah turned to her, his gray eyes seeming to burn in the firelight. "What are you scared of? That I'll trust the wrong person again? That all of this is just a dream and I'll have to wake up? That I don't deserve to be happy?" Elijah lifted his hand to her cheek, gently turning her face so she had to look into his eyes. "I've loved you since 5 years ago, Rose. Since the night you knelt beside me in that dark alley. I've waited for you for 5 years, and I'll wait as long as it takes. If you need time, I'll wait. If you need space, I'll step back. But I want you to know one thing." He leaned down until his forehead rested against hers. "You deserve happiness more than anyone I've ever known. And if you allow me, I'll spend my whole life proving it to you." Rose looked into his eyes and saw no lies there, no calculation, only pure love and the patient waiting of a man who had loved her long before she ever knew he existed. She didn't say anything more. She rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his, their first kiss, gentle and soft as the snow falling outside the window. Elijah kissed her back, one hand around her waist, one hand at the back of her neck, kissing her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, the one he'd waited for all his life. When they pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Rose looked at him and smiled. For the first time since that disastrous wedding day, her smile was one of pure, unfiltered happiness. She thought she had found peace, thought life had finally smiled on her at last. She didn't know the storm was about to return. A month had passed since that first kiss. A month of happiness, of waking in each other's arms, of stolen kisses in the hallway, of long nights talking by the fireplace until they both drifted off on the sofa. Rose had begun to believe that maybe life was finally smiling at her. Maybe she truly did deserve to be happy. But the darkness of the past refused to leave her in peace. That morning, Elijah left the estate early, the way he always did. He kissed Rose's forehead and told her he'd be back before dinner. Harrison went with him, leaving the estate with only a few servants inside and the security team outside. Rose didn't think much of it. She brewed a cup of tea and sat reading in the library, savoring the quiet morning. She didn't know there was a shadow lurking beyond the fence, waiting for an opening. Brandon Mercer had been running from debt collectors for months. He lived like a rat, hiding in cheap motels, eating leftovers, always looking over his shoulder to see if someone was following. The luxurious life of a professional con artist had ended the day he ran from the wedding, and it was all because of her. Rose Bennett. No, now Rose Blackwood. When Brandon heard that the girl he'd meant to scam had become the wife of one of the richest men in Chicago, he laughed like a madman in a filthy rented room. Fate was cruelly ironic. His poor, desperate target was now sitting on a pile of gold, and he was going to take a piece of that gold, no matter what it cost. He had watched the estate for days, memorized Elijah's routine, found weaknesses in the security system, and today, with the great boss gone to work, he decided to move. Brandon slipped into the estate through a back service door near the kitchen that he'd discovered during his surveillance. The staff were busy upstairs, no one noticing the intruder threading through the corridors. He found Rose in the library. She was seated in an armchair by the window, lost in a book, completely unaware of him. Brandon shut the door and locked it. The sound made Rose look up, and when she saw that familiar face, the book fell from her hands. Brandon. The name came out filled with fear and disgust. "Hello, Rose." He smiled, but the smile wasn't charming anymore. Now it looked unhinged and desperate. "Or should I call you Mrs. Blackwood? You're impressive. From a broke waitress to a billionaire's wife. Fast work." Rose stood, backing away step by step. She searched for an exit, but Brandon was blocking the only door. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to take what's mine." Brandon stepped closer. "You owe me, Rose. 6 months I spent courting you, spoiling you, and you repay me by taking another man?" "You lied to me!" Rose shouted. "You were going to steal my money. You were going to make me carry your debt." Minor details. Brandon flicked his hand. "Now you've got money. A lot of money. I just need a small share. $1 million. To your billionaire husband. That's pocket change." Rose shook her head. "I won't give you a single cent." The smile on Brandon's face vanished. He lunged and grabbed Rose's wrist, squeezing so hard she cried out. "Then I'll take you. Your billionaire husband will definitely pay a ransom to get his beloved wife back. 2 million. No, 5 million. Enough for me to disappear out of this country and live like a king." Rose panicked, but her mind turned strangely clear. 3 months of training with Elijah hadn't been for nothing. She remembered every lesson, every movement, every warning. Without thinking, Rose drove her free fist straight into Brandon's nose. Blood burst out, and he stumbled back, releasing her. Rose didn't wait. She kicked his knee exactly the way Elijah had taught her, sending him collapsing to the floor. Then she ran. She ran out of the library, down the corridor, screaming for help. Brandon roared behind her, trying to chase her despite the pain and the blood. But Rose was faster. She sprinted to Elijah's office, where she knew there was a direct line to Harrison. She slammed the button and screamed into it. "Harrison! There's an intruder! Brandon Mercer! He's inside the estate!" 15 minutes later, Brandon was restrained and tied on the living room floor by the security team. He screamed, cursed, threatened, but no one cared. Harrison called Elijah immediately. When the black Maybach screeched to a stop at the estate gate, Rose was still trembling on the sofa. A servant had wrapped a warm towel around her wrist, where bruises bloomed from Brandon's grip. The living room doors flew open. Elijah stormed in, his eyes sweeping the room until they found Rose. He rushed to her, dropped to his knees, and took her face in both hands as if he needed proof she was alive, still here. "Are you hurt? Did he do anything to you?" Rose looked into his eyes and saw pure fear there, inside that gray gaze. The Mafia kingpin Chicago feared was terrified for her. "I'm okay. I fought back. You taught me well." Elijah let out a breath and pulled her into his arms as if she might vanish the moment he let go. But then his eyes caught the bruise on her wrist. He lifted her hand, saw the mark, and his whole body went still. "He touched you?" His voice went so cold, Rose shivered. She nodded, and she saw something she hadn't seen in all these months, the Mafia kingpin losing control completely. Elijah rose slowly. His movement was measured, but every muscle in his body was drawn tight, like a wire about to snap. He turned to Brandon, bound on the floor, and that look sent a chill straight down Rose's spine. Those were no longer the eyes of the man who had held her through nightmares, who had kissed her softly by the fireplace. Those were the eyes of a killer, cold, ruthless, and completely out of control. Elijah walked toward Brandon, each step like a drumbeat announcing death. Brandon saw that look and began to tremble. The arrogance and desperation drained from him, replaced by the pure fear of a man who knew he was about to die. Please, sir, I'll never," he stammered, struggling against the ropes, uselessly. Elijah knelt beside him, grabbed his collar, and hauled him up with one hand, and with the other drew a dagger from somewhere. The blade flashed under the lights, and Brandon began to sob. "You dared to touch her." Elijah's voice was like cold wind moving through a graveyard. "You dared to frighten her. You dared to leave marks on her skin. I will make you suffer for every bruise you left on her. I'll make sure you regret every breath you take until the day you die." "Elijah," Rose's voice cut through the room, desperate. She rushed forward and stopped right behind him, both hands clamping around the arm that held the knife. "Please stop. Don't do this." Elijah didn't turn. His body stayed rigid, the blade still angled toward Brandon's throat. "He deserves to die, Rose. He tried to kidnap you. He meant to hurt you. I can't let him live." "I know, but I don't want you to kill him." Rose wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her forehead to his back. "Don't become a monster because of me. Don't let his blood stain the hands that hold me every night. I'm begging you." Elijah stood motionless. Rose could feel him trembling, fighting the instinct to kill. A war was tearing through him, between the monster who wanted to tear his enemy apart and the man who wanted to become worthy of the woman he loved. 1 minute passed. 2, 3. Finally, Elijah lowered the knife. He shoved Brandon back onto the floor and stood, turning to pull Rose into his arms, as if she were the only lifeline keeping him from sinking fully into the dark. "Harrison." His voice was still cold, but the killing edge had dulled. "Call the police. Hand him over with the entire fraud file. Make sure he doesn't escape a single charge." Harrison nodded and moved to carry out the order. Brandon was dragged away, still crying and babbling thanks for being spared. He didn't understand that a quick death might have been kinder than what was coming. 3 days later, the trial began. With the full evidence Elijah provided, including files on 6 victims, messages to accomplices, recordings of phone calls, and testimony from the women he had scammed, Brandon Mercer was sentenced to 15 years in prison. No chance of a reduced term, no chance of clemency. He would rot behind bars until he was old and broken. But Elijah still wasn't satisfied. One night, he drove to the prison where Brandon was being held. With his power, seeing a prisoner late at night wasn't a problem. He stood outside the bars, watching Brandon cower in the corner of his cell, and he smiled. A smile so cold Brandon began to shake, even though the air wasn't cold. "You'll be here for 15 years, Elijah said, his voice low enough that only the two of them could hear. 15 years is a long time, long enough to think about what you've done. But I want you to know one thing." He stepped closer, his face nearly against the bars. "If you think about her even once, even in a dream, I'll know. I have people everywhere, including inside this prison, and I'll make you disappear in this very cell, and no one will ever find your body. Do you understand?" Brandon nodded frantically, tears and snot running down his face. "I understand. I understand. I swear I'll never. I'll forget her. I swear." Elijah watched him for a few seconds, then turned and walked away without looking back. By the time he returned to the estate, it was nearly morning. Rose was waiting in the living room, still awake. When she saw him, she stood and ran into his arms. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you for not killing him. Thank you for listening to me." Elijah held her, his chin resting on the top of her head. "You ask, I do it. Always." Rose looked up at him. "Why? You're the boss. You don't have to listen to anyone." "Because to the world, I'm a monster." Elijah stroked her hair gently. "I've killed people, ruined lives, done things that would make even hell shudder. But with you, I want to be better. You make me want to try, to hold the monster inside me back, to become worthy of the love you give me." Rose didn't speak. She only held him tighter, listening to his heartbeat steady against her ear. She thought the storm had passed, that Brandon was locked away and would never come back to haunt her, that she and Elijah could finally live happily together without the past looming over them. She didn't know the greatest secret was still hidden, in a room she had never opened, inside the very walls of this estate. 6 months had passed since the day a fake wedding became real. 6 months of happiness, of love, of days when Rose believed she'd finally found where she belonged. She and Elijah had grown so close they felt inseparable. Every morning waking in his arms, every night falling asleep with his warmth beside her, she believed there were no secrets left between them. She was wrong. One afternoon, with Elijah at work and Rose alone in the estate, she decided to explore the parts of the enormous house she still hadn't set foot in. After 6 months, there were still corridors and rooms she didn't know. The mansion was too large, like a maze whose paths she still couldn't fully memorize. She walked along the 3rd-floor hallway, a place she rarely visited because it was the area Elijah used for work. She didn't mean to invade his private space. She only wanted to wander to clear her mind. But then she got lost. The corridors looked so similar she couldn't tell where she was anymore. She opened a door, thinking it would lead to the stairs down. It didn't. It was a room, and the moment Rose stepped inside, she felt as if someone had punched her straight in the stomach. The wall across from her was covered in photographs. Photographs of her, hundreds, maybe thousands, taken over 5 years. Photos of her working at Old Pete's Diner. Photos of her grocery shopping. Photos of her sitting in the park reading. Photos of her crying alone in her tiny rented room. Photos of her smiling at customers. Photos of her wearing her mother's heart necklace. Every photograph had been taken from a distance, clearly with a professional telephoto lens. She had never known. Not once had she realized she was being watched. Rose moved deeper into the room, her legs shaking. Beside the photo wall was a large table stacked with files. She picked one up and opened it. A detailed dossier on her life, her daily schedule, the people she met, the conversations she had with coworkers, even the messages she sent and received. 5 years of her life recorded with meticulous precision, as if she were a research project, as if she were prey being hunted. "Ma'am." Harrison's voice came from the doorway, and Rose spun around, startled. Elijah's most loyal man stood there, his face tight with worry. "You shouldn't be in here." "What is this, Harrison?" Rose asked, her voice shaking. "Explain it to me. Right now." Harrison exhaled, stepped into the room, and closed the door. "This is the room the boss used to watch you for the past 5 years. But please understand, he did it to protect you, not to control you." "Protect?" Rose gave a bitter laugh. "By watching my every move? By taking pictures of me without my knowledge? By reading my messages? By removing the people who wanted to hurt you?" Harrison met her eyes. Do you remember the drunk who attacked you in that dark alley 4 years ago? He disappeared the next day because the boss handled him. Do you remember the coworker who used to grope you at the cleaning company? The boss made sure he lost his job and never found work in Chicago again. Do you remember the 3 men you dated? The ones who lied to you, made you cry, then left? All 3 ran into serious trouble after they walked away from you. Rose shook her head, backing up until her spine hit the wall of photographs. No, this is insane. He had no right. The boss loves you. Harrison's voice was firm. He's loved you since the night you saved his life, and he protected you the only way he knows how, from the shadows. Rose couldn't listen anymore. She stood there in a room filled with proof of Elijah's obsession with her, and felt like everything she thought she knew was collapsing. She had believed she understood him, believed there were no secrets left between them. But this? 5 years of surveillance, thousands of photographs, people who disappeared for daring to hurt her. She didn't know whether to feel protected or terrified, moved or horrified. All her emotions tangled together into a knot she couldn't untie. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. The door opened, and Elijah walked in, still wearing his work suit. He froze when he saw Rose standing in the middle of the secret room, eyes red, face drained pale. "Rose," he started, but she cut him off. "You watched me." Her voice was ice. 5 years. You watched me like prey. You knew everything about me, every step, every breath, every tear, and you never said a word. Elijah didn't justify it. He didn't explain. He didn't try to soften the truth. Instead, he did something Rose never expected. The Mafia kingpin, the man all of Chicago feared, slowly sank to his knees in front of her. Elijah's knees met the cold wooden floor. He stayed there, kneeling in front of Rose, in front of the wall covered in her photographs, in front of every piece of evidence of his obsession for the past 5 years. He didn't try to stand. He didn't try to explain. He didn't try to justify what he had done. He only knelt there, head bowed, like a sinner waiting for judgment. "I won't lie to you," Elijah began, his voice deep and heavy. "I watched you for 5 years. I knew everything about you, from the food you like, to the books you read, from the nights you cried alone, to the days you smiled at customers in the diner. I hired people to photograph you, to document your life, to report to me every day." Rose stood there with tears running down her cheeks, but she didn't cut him off. She needed to hear it. She needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "I killed for you," Elijah continued. "The drunk who tried to attack you in that dark alley, I made him disappear. The 3 men who made you cry, I ruined their lives. Anyone who dared hurt you, I dealt with in my way. You didn't know it, but I've been the darkness wrapped around you for 5 years. He looked up at her, and Rose saw that in his gray eyes there wasn't regret for doing those things. There was pain, because he knew those things were frightening her. "I know this is wrong. I know I had no right to control your life like that. I know what I did is obsession, insanity, something unforgivable." He paused, swallowing hard. "But you have to understand, Rose. In all my dark life, you were the only light. The night you saved me in that alley, you didn't only save my life. You saved my soul. You showed me there are still good people in this world. People who will help a stranger without demanding anything. And from that night on, I couldn't stop thinking about you." Elijah lifted a hand as if he wanted to touch her, then stopped in midair and lowered it again. "I love you, Rose. Not as property, not as prey, but as a man loves the woman who redeemed him. I know I don't deserve you. I know what I did went too far, and I won't beg you to forgive me, because I don't know if this can be forgiven." He bowed his head again. "If you want to leave, I'll let you go. I won't stop you. I won't watch you anymore. I'll give you everything you need to start a new life, far from me, far from this darkness. You have the right to choose, and I'll respect whatever decision you make." Rose looked down at the man kneeling in front of her. The Mafia kingpin all of Chicago feared. A cold-blooded killer, a monster in the dark, but also the man who had held her through nightmares, the man who had learned to cook the foods she loved, the man who had cried alone in the rose garden on the anniversary of his mother's death, the man who knelt before her and confessed everything without trying to defend himself. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Anger at being watched, terror at living with a killer, gratitude at being loved with that kind of fierce obsession, all of it twisted together, spinning in her chest like a storm with no end. I need time, Rose said, her voice breaking. I can't think right now. I need to leave. Elijah nodded, still on his knees. I understand. Rose turned and walked away. She didn't run. She only walked, one step at a time. Out of the room filled with her photographs. Down the hallway, down the stairs, through the living room, and out the front door of the estate. She didn't look back. Not once. Elijah was still kneeling when Harrison stepped into the room. The loyal man looked at his boss, and for the first time in 20 years together, he saw Elijah Blackwood looking like a man who had been completely defeated. Boss, she's gone. Elijah rose slowly, went to the window, and looked down. But at least here, she could think without being surrounded by walls covered in photographs of herself. The next day, Rose went to Old Pete's diner. The old man pulled her into a tight hug as if she had come back from the dead. He didn't ask many questions. He set a bowl of hot soup in front of her and sat across the table, waiting in silence until she was ready to talk. I left the estate, Rose said, her voice exhausted. I found out Elijah watched me for 5 years. There's a whole room full of photos of me, Pete. Thousands of them. Files about my life. Everything. Old Pete nodded slowly, not looking shocked the way she expected. Did you know? Rose asked, eyes wide. I didn't know the details. Old Pete let out a long sigh. But I knew someone had been protecting you from the shadows for years. The men who tried to hurt you either disappeared or ran into trouble. I'm not stupid, kid. I knew that wasn't luck. Rose looked at him, not knowing what to say. Old Pete reached across the table and took her hand, his voice gentle in the way her father never got the chance to be. Do you love him? The question was simple, but Rose couldn't answer right away. She sat there staring down at the soup cooling in front of her, and felt tears rise again. I don't know, Pete. I think I love him. But now I don't know if it's real love or if I'm just used to being protected by him. I don't know if I love that man, or if I only love the feeling of safety he gives me. Old Pete was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. You know, people aren't perfect. No one in this world is perfect. We all have dark corners, mistakes, things we're not proud of. The question is whether we can live with someone else's darkness. He looked straight into Rose's eyes. He watched you, yes, that was wrong. But he also let you go when you wanted to leave. He didn't lock you up, didn't force you to stay, didn't threaten you. He knelt in front of you and confessed everything. Then let you decide. Kid, a controlling man doesn't do that. A truly obsessed man would never let you walk away. Rose listened, and felt something inside her beginning to shift. But he killed people, Pete. For me. He ruined other people's lives for me. And how do you feel about that? Rose thought for a long time. I don't know. I should be disgusted. I should be afraid. But part of me feels protected. And that makes me afraid of myself. Old Pete nodded. That's because you're human, kid. We all have two sides. The side that wants to be good, and the side that wants to be protected at any cost. There's nothing wrong with feeling safe when you know someone would do anything for you. He squeezed Rose's hand tighter. I only want to ask you one thing. If he died tomorrow, how would you feel? Rose couldn't answer. But even imagining it made her chest tighten like someone was crushing her heart. Meanwhile, back at the Blackwood estate, Elijah was living like a hollow shell. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He didn't work. He only sat in the room filled with Rose's photographs, staring at them and waiting. Harrison was so worried he didn't dare leave the estate. In 20 years working for Elijah, he had never seen his boss like this. Elijah Blackwood had been shot, betrayed, threatened more times than he could count, but nothing had ever brought him down the way Rose leaving had. Boss, you have to eat something. Harrison set a tray of food on the table. Elijah didn't look at it. Is she okay? I've got people watching from a distance. She's at Pete's diner. She's safe. Good. Elijah's voice was rough, worn raw by days of silence. Don't interfere. Don't approach her. I promised I'd let her choose. But boss, I promised Harrison. Elijah cut him off. Even if she chooses never to come back, I'll keep my word. That's the only thing I can do for her. 7 days passed. 7 days of Rose living in her old apartment, working at Old Pete's diner, and thinking. She thought about Elijah, about what he had done, about what he had said. She thought about the safety of his arms, about the rare smile he'd given when he lifted the gardener's little girl, about the poems he read before sleep. She thought about the room full of photographs, about the frightening obsession that was also full of love. And she thought about what old Pete had said. A controlling man doesn't let you go. On the 7th night, Rose stood in front of the Blackwood estate gates. She had her answer. Her heart hammered like a war drum. She drew a deep breath and stepped through the gate. Everything was about to change. The guard at the gate recognized Rose immediately. He hurried to press the intercom and report inside. In less than 2 minutes, the front doors of the estate flew open, and Elijah ran out. He ran as if his life depended on reaching her as fast as he could, but when he was only a few steps away, he stopped short. Rose looked at him, and her chest tightened. In only 7 days, Elijah looked as if he had aged 10 years. His face was gaunt. Rough stubble shadowed his jaw, his eyes sunken with black circles beneath them. The suit he wore was wrinkled, as if he'd been wearing it for days without changing. This was no longer the powerful, ice-cold kingpin she had known. This was a man breaking apart from the inside. Elijah stood there with his arms hanging at his sides, not daring to come any closer. He looked at her as if she were an illusion that might dissolve at any moment. He didn't dare touch her. He didn't dare hope. He only stood there and waited, terrified she had come to say a final goodbye. Rose. He said her name, his voice raw and shaking. I've been thinking. Rose cut him off. She had to say everything in her heart before she lost her nerve. For 7 days, I've done nothing but think. About you. About what you've done. About the darkness you live in. About the blood on your hands. Elijah closed his eyes, as if every word was a knife sinking into his chest. He had braced himself for this. She would say she couldn't accept it. She would say goodbye. She would leave and never come back. And he would have to accept it, because he had promised to let her choose. I can't fully accept everything you've done, Rose went on, and Elijah felt his heart breaking piece by piece. Watching me for 5 years, killing for me, knowing everything about me while I knew nothing about you. I can't pretend those things don't matter. I can't pretend I'm not scared when I think about them. Elijah nodded, still with his eyes shut. I understand. I will. But I can't leave you. He opened his eyes, staring at her in shock. Rose was crying, tears streaming down her face, but she kept her gaze locked on his. For 7 days I tried to forget you. I tried to convince myself I didn't need you. I tried to live the way I lived before I met you. But I can't. Every night I dream of you. Every morning I wake up reaching to the other side of the bed looking for you. Every moment I miss you until it feels like I'm losing my mind. She stepped closer, erasing the distance between them. You're the only person in my life who has never lied to me. No matter how ugly the truth was, you told it. You gave me a choice when my whole life I never had one. You knelt in front of me and let me decide my own fate. No one has ever done that for me. Rose lifted her hand and set it against his cheek. Elijah trembled under that touch, as if he had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by her. I love you, Elijah, the light and the dark, the man who reads poetry before he sleeps, and the Mafia boss with blood on his hands. I love everything that made you who you are, even if I can't accept it completely, and I want to be with you, if you still want me. Elijah couldn't speak. He only pulled her into his arms and held her tight, holding her as if she might disappear the instant he loosened his grip. And then Rose felt his shoulders shake. She felt warm drops fall into her hair. Elijah Blackwood, Chicago's kingpin, the monster in the dark, was crying. For the first time in 26 years, he cried in front of someone else. I love you, he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. I love you more than anything in this world. I can't promise I'll be perfect. I can't promise I'll change completely. But I promise I'll love you until my last breath. I promise I'll try to become better because of you. I promise I'll never lie to you, no matter how painful the truth is. Rose held him back, the two of them standing there in the estate courtyard under the pale moonlight, clinging to each other as if this were the last time they would ever be able to. The guards and servants watched from a distance, no one daring to come close. They had never seen their boss like this, and they knew they were witnessing something sacred. When they finally pulled apart, Elijah rested his forehead against hers, staring deep into her eyes. This is the real beginning, Rose. Our life won't be easy. There will be darkness. There will be danger. There will be times you'll want to run. But I'll always be here. Always waiting for you. Always loving you. Rose smiled through her tears. I know. And I'll be here. Beside you. In the light and in the dark. And they both knew this was the real beginning. 1 year later, the rose garden at the Blackwood estate had been dressed like a fairy tale dream. Deep red roses bloomed under the golden afternoon sun, petals trembling in a soft breeze that carried a sweet, lingering fragrance. 30 white chairs stood in 2 neat rows on the lush green lawn, each one decorated with white ribbon and small rose sprigs. There was no grand church, no hundreds of unfamiliar guests, no showmanship or empty glitter, only the people who truly mattered to Rose and Elijah, 30 souls who had witnessed their stormy journey and stayed, no matter how insane it all seemed. Old Pete sat in the front row, tears already falling even before the ceremony began. Harrison stood beside Elijah, wearing a suit for the first time, not for work, but to serve as best man for his boss. The household staff, the gardener, the cooks, everyone had been invited as honored guests. And in the front row, in the place of greatest honor, 2 framed photographs stood side by side. On one side was a picture of Rose's parents, their smiles still warm the way they'd always been. On the other was a photograph of Elijah's mother, the woman stolen from him when he was only 10. Both families, though no longer alive, were still present on the most important day of their children's lives. Aunt Margaret wasn't there. Rose had chosen to cut herself off completely from that toxic past. That woman didn't deserve a place in Rose's happiness. When the wedding music began, every eye turned toward the end of the aisle. Rose appeared, and Elijah felt his heart miss a beat. She wore a simple white wedding dress, no sparkling stones, no trailing train, only soft satin that held her figure with elegant, pure restraint. Around her neck was her mother's silver heart necklace, dulled by time yet still catching the afternoon light. It was the only jewelry she wore, and to Elijah, she was more beautiful than any bride in the world. Old Pete walked her down the aisle, his aged arm trembling, proud all the same. He cried even more than the first time he had walked her into that small church outside Chicago to marry a fraud. But this time, the tears were joy. The tears of a father in spirit watching his girl find the harbor she deserved. When Rose reached Elijah, she looked into his eyes and saw an entire ocean of love in that gray gaze. He took her hand, and she felt the faint tremor in his fingers. The Mafia kingpin, a man who feared nothing, was shaking with happiness. The pastor began the ceremony, but when it came time for vows, Rose and Elijah had decided to write their own. Rose spoke first, her voice thick with emotion but steady. "Elijah, you aren't the prince from the fairy tales my mother used to tell me. You don't ride a white horse. You don't wear shining armor. You don't come from some distant kingdom. You're something more than that. You're the darkness that protected me when I didn't even know it. You're the man who loved me when I didn't believe I deserved to be loved. You're the man who waited for me for 5 long years without asking for anything in return. I swear I'll love you for everything you are, the light and the dark, the angel and the monster, because to me, you're perfect." Elijah looked at her, and for the first time in front of 30 people, Chicago's kingpin let his tears fall without trying to hide them. "Rose, you're the light that pulled me out of the dark. You're the reason I still have a shred of humanity left. You saved me not only once, but every day, simply by existing. I swear I'll love you until my last breath, and if there's another life after this, I'll find you and love you again. Wherever you are, whoever you are, I'll always find you, because my soul belongs to you." When the pastor declared them husband and wife, Elijah didn't wait another second. He pulled Rose into his arms and kissed her. Not a gentle kiss on the forehead like the first time in the church, but a real kiss, full of passion and love, the kiss of a man who had waited his whole life to love and to be loved in return. The 30 guests rose to their feet applauding. Old Pete sobbed openly. Harrison gave a rare smile. And Rose, in the arms of the man she loved, finally understood that the prince in a fairy tale doesn't always ride a white horse. 5 years after the wedding day, the Blackwood estate was no longer a cold, silent castle the way it had once been. Now every corner of the house overflowed with a child's laughter and the warmth of a happy family. Lily, their 3-year-old daughter with her father's gray eyes and her mother's radiant smile, ran through the rose garden every day like a little princess in her own kingdom. James, their 1-year-old son, was taking his first unsteady steps inside the protective circle of the man who had once been the most feared kingpin in Chicago. Elijah had changed so much since becoming a father. He had shifted his entire empire toward legitimacy, walking away from the underground businesses so his children would never have to carry the stigma of being the children of a criminal. That process wasn't easy. It took nearly 3 years of negotiation, restructuring, and at times direct confrontation with people who didn't want him leaving the underworld. But Elijah did it, because he wanted his children to grow up in the light, not in the darkness the way he had. Rose had found her own calling too. She opened a school called Second Chances Academy, a place for poor children, orphans, babies who had been abandoned and abused the way she once was. The school provided free education, free meals, and most importantly, the love those children had never received. Every day she walked into the classrooms and saw young eyes brighten with hope. Rose felt her life finally had real meaning. Old Pete lived in a small, lovely house right on the estate grounds. The old man, now 73 years old, was cared for like a true father, laughing and playing with his 2 grandchildren every day. And at last, after so many years alone in his little diner, he had a real family. He still cried easily, but now the tears were happy ones, the kind that came when he looked at Rose, the girl he had taken in when she was an 18-year-old homeless teenager, and saw the woman she had become, fulfilled, successful, and loved. And Aunt Margaret had gone bankrupt a few years earlier because of bad investments and a habit of reckless spending. She had contacted Rose, begging for help through tears. Rose sent her money, enough for her to live comfortably, but she didn't meet her. Not out of hatred, but because she had released the past. Aunt Margaret held no power over her life anymore, and Rose chose to close that chapter gently instead of carrying resentment in her heart forever. On the night of their 5th wedding anniversary, after the 2 children had fallen asleep, Rose and Elijah sat together in the rose garden, the very place where they had held their real wedding. A full moon hung high over the deep red roses, casting a romantic light that felt like something out of a dream. Rose rested her head on Elijah's shoulder and whispered, "You know, I used to think the day I was abandoned at the wedding was the worst day of my life." Elijah wrapped an arm around her, his lips brushing a soft kiss into her hair. And now, Rose lifted her face, her green eyes shining in the moonlight. "Now I think that was the day you finally dared to come close to me. The day the darkness decided to step into the light." Elijah smiled, that rare smile only Rose ever got to see, and then he bent to kiss her, a kiss gentle and deep, carrying the love of 5 years of marriage and 10 years of waiting. And Rose understood that sometimes the prince in a fairy tale doesn't ride a white horse. Sometimes he is the darkness that loved you from far away, quietly protecting you when you never even knew, waiting for the exact moment you needed him most to step into the light. Sometimes being abandoned isn't the ending. It's the way fate guides you to where you truly belong. This story teaches us that happiness sometimes comes from the places we least expect, that the wounds of the past don't define our future, and that true love can heal every sorrow if we are brave enough to open our hearts and receive it. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If you felt moved and you'd like to hear more meaningful stories like this every day, please subscribe to the channel, hit like, and share the video with the people you love. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of anything in your own real life? Leave a comment below to share what's in your heart. We truly want to hear from you. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.